got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care.
Welcome to episode number 5 of Ticket to Ride. We look at the recent Ryde-Eastwood Open on my games in it from a few weekends ago. This is my round 5 game. I'm wide against Armen Ayvazyan. His ACF rating is 22.27 and his FIDE rating is 21.99. So obviously a fairly tough game where I'm actually the lower rated player in the game. But let's see how it went. Started off with a line that I play from time to time, the Tromposky, and Armen played the D5 line, which is one of the main alternatives in the opening. Here, the idea behind the whole playing Bishop G5 is to take on F6 and compromise the black pawn structure. And after E3, my idea here is to make use of these pawns. Basically put these pawns on black squares, leave my white squared bishop to control to control the white squares, and use those features together to sort of set up a good position. Obviously easier said than done, and black's obviously going to try and do something against that. Bishop d6 is a fairly standard move in this sort of position, and here I played c4. My idea here obviously is basically to attack this sort of pawn on d5, and a natural sort of defensive move like c6 I'm happy to just swap and basically pile up on this pawn. So I've got a knight coming to c3, I can put the bishop on g2, I can put the queen on b3, and they're all again targeting this weak pawn on d5. So ideally I'd like something like that to happen if I can, if black makes the mistake of just defending d5, allowing me to swap off. It gives me a fixed weakness to target, and I can bring a lot of pieces around, and if need be I can even bring, you know, the other, sorry, I can even bring the other knight around to help attack that d5 square as well. So that would be something that I really like to have happen if at all possible. However, Armen simply took on c4. It seems fairly logical. I recaptured, and he played f5, which is a common line, a common move in these type of positions, and the type of setup that black's looking for is pushing the pawn to g6 and having these pawns on white squares on the king side. The thing about this is that sometimes this bishop might want to re-maneuver back to g7, but bishop d6 is actually a very common move in the opening, so somewhat unusual in a way. And also this is a move that sort of again can transpose in a lot of ways. The most common move after bishop takes c4 is actually the castle, but often transposes back into a position like what you see in the game after something like knight c3, c6, knight f3, and then sort of f5, and we're back to a position very similar to the game. So going back to the line after f5, I played normal natural developing move, knight c3, again trying to keep all the squares in the centre under control. Black played c6, plays developed with knight f3, and black castle. So this is a maybe not the most common type of opening position you get, but in this line it's a reasonably common sort of position that you'll get. And here I played a move that has been fairly rare in this position. I actually played h4. To some extent this is inspired a bit by a game by Leveronian from earlier this year. against Hare Krishna, where in a Queen's Gambit, in a sort of vaguely similar, from a structural point of view, vaguely similar, he used this idea of just playing h4 and g4 and going for this big kingside hack, which turned out fantastically. My idea here isn't kind of exactly the same. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to get in g4 with the black pawns here on f5, but what my idea is here is to disrupt this sort of plan of putting all these pawns on white squares. What I'm attempting to do is get that pawn up to h5 and really fight for that g6 square. Also, I might be able to open up an h-file towards the king, given that the king's over there. And again, it's going to make sort of the defense of some of these weaknesses that black has in their position a little awkward. I'm going to try and make use of the diagonal, potentially targeting the f7 pawn. Again, the f5 pawn's another potential target. Again, possibly with a move like, say, queen c2, or maybe even bringing the bishop back to d3. And if I can discourage this g6 defensive idea, it gives me ways to sort of pile up on that f pawn and hopefully win it. As for the actual position itself, h4 in my database has only been played once before, which is a game from 2005, but the move was used in a very different way. Again, this idea of sort of h5 and disrupting the pawn structure isn't something that was used in that game. However, the h4 move and the similar idea that I used has actually been used in this kind of position, but a little bit later. And in fact, Vladimir Kramnik has actually played this position after castles, and in that position he played queen c2. This is from a blitz game against Tkachev in 2008, and that game continued knight d7, bishop d3, g6, and then h4. So he actually waited for Tkachev to commit to this sort of plan of, you know, the pawns on white squares on the king side before playing this h4 thrust with h5 sort of threatening as a follow-up, even though it doesn't actually happen for I don't think at all in the game. Follows up queen e7, actually I lie. Yeah, he follows it up with a right away h5, knight f6 taking on g6. You can see here, however, because Kramnik's taken the bishop off that c4 square and that diagonal towards g8, Tkachev's been allowed to recapture with the f pawn. So it does give Kramnik, he does get the semi-open h-file. It's not an open h-file completely, and this makes black's defensive job a little bit easier, that he can sort of potentially defend along the rank with sort of pieces like queens and rooks and the like, and as much pressure as you can bear on that h7 weakness that Tkachev has. So rather than continuing with going through this whole game, needless to say that this sort of h4, h5 idea has been played by a reputable chess player in Kramnik. So going back to the game, after h4, Armen played knight d7. Again, a fairly natural move, given that knight on d7 ordinarily wants to head to the f6 square, and from there it obviously controls quite a number of useful squares around the king. I played h5 immediately, not waiting for g6. He played knight f6 and I played queen c2. And this position has actually been reached 5 times in some games in my database. You've had someone like Antonetta Stefanova playing the white side of this, and you've also had Katerina Lano playing the black side. Obviously, the clash itself wasn't a Stefanova-Lano clash. However, the fact that you've got two very strong, 2400 plus players playing this position from either side shows that it's not entirely ridiculous in terms of the idea that I came up with. Because I hadn't actually, the sort of h4, h5 idea was something I kind of came up with at the board rather than something that I'd sort of previously studied or prepared. Here Ayvazyan played Queen A5. Interesting idea. There's sort of multiple ideas to it. Obviously, it pins the knight on C3, which potentially allows a move like knight E4 to happen. Another possible idea, again trying to exploit that pin on C3, the bishop might also come to B4, and maybe there's an idea of creating weaknesses on C3 that can maybe be exploited later on. Another possible idea could be pushing the pawn to F4 and then swinging the queen across to the king side, which is something that Armen actually did a little bit later in the game. And Queen A5, as far as I'm aware, has only been played once before, from the 1996 Olympiad between Kosic and Vakidov in that game. From here, it actually continued. Kosic actually played Castle's queenside. The game continued knight D7, King B1, Rook E8, Knight D2, Bishop B4, Bishop B3, Queen C7, Knight E2, Bishop D6, Bishop D3, and G6. And Vakidov actually went on to win this position somewhat down the track, but it wasn't so much to do with the actual opening itself. It was more to do with just sort of tactics going straight later on in the game. However, getting back to the Queen A5 position, Hero played Knight D2. So this is the theoretical first sort of new move of the game. But in some ways the idea that I use is similar to the Kosic game. The idea here, as far as I was concerned, was to basically break this pin. So now both the knight on C3 and the knight on D2 are free to move around. They both help support the E4 square. This knight can maybe jump to B3, again putting a question to the queen, making it possibly maybe end up on a somewhat awkward square. I also had vague ideas for possibly later on in the game, now that I've sort of cleared the F-file, sort of vague ideas of maybe one day playing F4, knight F3, knight E5, and trying to sort of cement a knight on that E5 square. Obviously it's not so easy to do, given that black still has a pawn on F7, and potentially could kick the knight away by playing F6 at some stage. But this was some kind of an idea that I thought could come into play later on in the game, even though it didn't actually happen. Obviously there are some drawbacks with that. In particular, what happens with the E3 pawn, and that it's now a backward pawn, and there's sort of obviously the rook coming to the E file and knight G4 are fairly obvious ways to target the E pawn if it's a backward pawn, as opposed to the pawn on F2, which really isn't so easy for black to get at. So even though it was there as an idea, I really sort of didn't give it too much thought later on. So here Armen played Bishop B4, and I played Rook C1. Fritz prefers either Knight B3, or another alternative is the immediate H6, trying to create some kind of weakness around the black king, and obviously in particular maybe something on the black squares. The issue with this is that obviously I don't have a black square bishop, which if I did, H6 I think would be a fantastic idea, or it would be an idea I'd at least be more likely to consider. However, it does potentially leave this H6 pawn a bit vulnerable. My way of thinking to this was that black might be able to play G6, leave the pawn on H6, and then basically maneuver around it, and then bring their pieces back around to bear and sort of slowly gang up on this H6 pawn, maneuvering the bishop back to F8, knight coming to g4, and the pawn on h6 is really fairly difficult to defend, and I don't really want to put sort of two rooks behind it trying to just defend a pawn that I'd really rather prefer wasn't there. So in this case I thought rook c1, to my mind, made a lot of sense. The c-file could have some action later on. There might also be the possibility of maybe getting the rook into the game via c5 and then swinging across to the king side is another idea that might eventuate later on. However, none of this actually happened. Armen decided to play f4, which looks like a fairly natural move in this position. Obviously if I take, that's opening up my king that's still sort of stuck in the centre. Yes, I might temporarily win a pawn, but in the long term it creates problems for me. The pawn on d4 becomes very weak, and again, as I was saying, my king sort of is a target for sort of obvious attacking ideas. You've got the rook's coming to the e-file, bishop coming to g4, or maybe a knight coming in there as well. The queen can maybe swing across to the king side, and all of a sudden I'm the one that has to go on the defensive. So the logical move, I thought, in response to this was to play e4, and Armen swung his queen across to the king side to g5, obviously threatening the g2 pawn. So I simply played king f1. Castling isn't really a major concern. I'm obviously not going to cast the king side now that I've got the pawn out on h5. And seeing as I've played rook c1, I obviously can't do anything on the queen side. So my king is going to be left in the centre during this game. But the main thing I was looking at here with playing king f1, it does two things. Yes, the obvious thing it does is defend the g2 pawn, but it also gets out of this pin, or the pin that I was in, from the b4 bishop. So now the knights are free to move wherever they would like. I'm going to follow this up with bishop g4, and this gave me ideas possibly later on to reinforce the centre of maybe playing f3. However, immediately I played e5, obviously attacking the knight on f6, and almost in some ways tempting him to play knight takes h5. Armen chose knight d5, however Fritz actually goes in for the knight takes h5 idea, but I think it's actually fairly dangerous for black. Line might run something like knight e4, queen h6, rook h4, bishop f5, bishop e2, g6, bishop takes, g takes, and there's all these weak pawns, f7, h7, h5, f4, they're all weak. I've got sort of ideas of sort of jumping the knight into f6, which obviously is a great spot for the knight. I've also got ideas of maybe swinging the rook across to the h-file to help put pressure on the h-pawn. So even though from a material standpoint black sort of got the bishop pair as a pawn up, I'm more than happy to play this position as white. I think the weaknesses on the king side are really just going to be too much of a problem for black in the long term anyway. So back to the game and Armen's knight d5. This has another problem, that it loses a pawn. Again, this idea of knight e4 is a very useful one. Armen played the queen back to h6. Twofold there, stopping obviously my pawn from coming to h6, as well as keeping an eye on some of those critical squares around the king side. I took on d5 with the bishop. Armen recaptured and I played knight d5. Obviously, if instead of recapturing the bishop, if he takes on c3, then I can simply recapture with the e4 knight, and whenever he takes back on d5 I still manage to recapture with a knight, and I'm still up a pawn. So no problems there. I'm happy to obviously win a pawn back, particularly with it being a central pawn. He played rook c8, fairly logical move, and I just brought the other knight back to c3, so I'm still threatening the bishop, blocking the c file as well, so it's hopefully going to cut down some of the activity that he might get from the rooks. He swapped the bishop for the knight. I recaptured just with the pawn. I could have possibly tried knight e7 check, however I thought after king h8, knight takes c8, he could actually throw in bishop takes d4, which again leaves me in a bit of a difficult spot. I'm either losing the knight back or dropping another central pawn. I can play a move like knight d6 to save the knight, but then the bishop takes e5, obviously threatening the knight on d6. There's other ideas of maybe the rook coming into the game via the d file, the e file maybe. The queen can always swing around to a square like a6 and threaten the king from there. So I am sort of somewhat concerned about the safety of my king in this sort of position. Yes, I'm sort of notionally in exchange up. However, there really are sort of long-term problems. This bishop, the two bishops that Black has are fantastic in this position. This f4 pawn, and in particular the threat of it coming to f3, is something I'm definitely going to be worried about. So I didn't really like that idea of just taking on e7. So instead of doing that, I did just recapture with the pawn. Obviously now I'm still threatening knight e7. So plays rook e8. f3, this idea to again get rid of the bishop. It also creates something of a safety area for my king in that I'm not sort of stuck just going to sort of g1. I can sort of give me a bit more flexibility, as well as possibly allowing maybe my queen to come around to the h file if it needs to via f2, although it doesn't end up doing that, but it gives me those sort of possibilities. Bishop came back to e6, attacking the knight. Fairly logical defensive move, just playing queen e4, centralizing, and I'm now threatening to win the pawn on f4. So we swapped on d5, and then he played queen a6 check. And at first sight, this ending looks anything but sort of clearly winning for white. However, it's really difficult, I think, for black to defend. Here I just played king f2, and again, my idea now is to go after this this f4 pawn. I've got ideas to say rook h4, queen e4, and it's really tough for black to defend that f4 pawn. He tried queen d3. And that looks like a fairly strong move, given that he's obviously threatening queen e3 check as well. He's obviously threatening the c3 pawn. Potentially the other rook might be able to get into the game as well. And my king seems a bit vulnerable there on f2. However, after queen e4, I think that covers pretty much all the bases. And here Fritz is more than happy with my position. Armen actually chose to play rook takes c3. However, Fritz prefers the option of sort of playing queen d2 and going into the rook ending in this sort of position, which Fritz says is better for white. Basically, because the plan is, yes, I might be dropping the e pawn. However, in the meantime, my plan is to basically start pushing these the C and D pawn, and the king can come into this fantastic e4 square, which obviously keeps an eye on this sort of the e pawn, and I can sort of swing the other rook around, and it's going to be very difficult for black to defend all the threats, stopping the d pawn, especially when it's supported by rooks and the c pawn. So that is what Fritz would have considered the best defense for black. However, Armen played rook takes c3. It seems fairly logical. However, you'll see what the drawback to this is. I simply captured on c3. Fritz actually prefers taking an f4 with a queen. Something I considered, but I thought it was probably a bit too risky. I thought it was easy to sort of swap off pieces and make use of my advanced pawns. So I took on c3. Armen threw in a queen d2 check. There is a method to the madness. However, it does kind of force, in a way, my hand to an idea that I want to play anyway. I played king g1. He took on c3. I took on f4. The problem now that my king is back on g1, it means that the only way that my rook on h1 is actually going to get active is to come up to h4. Either that, or I have to waste another king move by playing a move like king h2 and then swinging my rook across the back rank to maybe c1 or d1 or e1 or wherever I think is the most appropriate place for it. However, the big problem is that when my rook comes to h4, it's actually a fantastic square for the rook. It can join in an attack on the king, coming to g4 in conjunction with the h-pawn. It sort of develops threats really, really quickly. Whereas if the king's back on f2, it does seem a bit more natural to swing the rook across the back rank to maybe a d1 or c1 or some square like that. So throwing in that queen d2 check may not have actually been the best sort of idea for Armen there. And you see this after the next move. Fritz has already sort of jumped the suggestion of playing rook d8 and attacking the weak d pawn, which is what Armen played. Fritz actually, the alternative to this is playing queen a1 check, king h2, taking on a2, and then rook c1. Definitely better for white. However, there's still, you know, it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. There's still quite a bit of work to finish it off. Although the rook most likely is going to get down to the 7th rank and be a real thorn in black's side here, and I've obviously still got potential threats on the king side with the h pawn and the like. So this is definitely a better position for white, but it's still far from over. White still has a bit of work to do, and black's got plenty of defensive resources here. But after rook d8, I can play a very natural move which doubles as an attacking move, rook h4. Now I'm going to try queen a1, and I just played king h2. My king is perfectly safe, and this the rook at h4 can suddenly come to life, going to g4 and taking down the g file. Here Armen played the losing move, although the position's already overwhelming because the rook's suddenly in the attack. I actually played rook takes a2, and h6 is just a crusher move that you can't really stop. Obviously, the move that I've got afterwards is the big threat, but here, if he captures on h6, I've got really a choice. I can recapture on h6 with a queen. I'm threatening taking on h7. I might throw in there's rook g4 followed by queen g7 mate as well. So lots of threats immediately. If he plays g6, pushes past obviously queen f6, and he can't cover the queen mate on g7. Or he can try something similar to what happened in the game and just play queen back to e6, and then queen g5 is the winning move. I'm obviously threatening mate on g7 and taking the rook with mate on d8. So this is where Armen chose to resign. But you can see some of these ideas throughout the game early on. This idea of starting an attack early on, this H4 idea early on in the game seems a bit, I guess, amateurish, not sort of the usual thing you'd expect from a game, but it can actually work given that it's disrupting a lot of what Black's natural plans are in that position. That idea of controlling the white squares on the king side with that sort of F7, G6, H7 and F5 pawn structure. The fact that you can sort of dissuade or sort of discourage Black from playing that idea really reduces a lot of the defensive options that Black has, and the fact that I don't really need to castle in that position given that Black hasn't really got any threats in the centre. And even though I'd obviously given away the bishop pair very early on, Black wasn't really able to utilise that at all. So definitely one of my better wins, not only for the weekend, but one of my better wins over the last sort of year or two. Beating someone 2200 is always a very good thing. So hopefully you enjoyed the game, and hopefully we'll be back for episode 6 in the coming days. Thanks. Just remember, check out the blog melbournegamescoach.blogspot.com.